Let's start with the part that most people don't want to talk about. Mark Carney. Yeah, Mark Carney, the one whose words always seem, accidentally aligned with where the world ends up going. And when you hear, remarks like the world has changed, so much since that last visit, progress we have made in the partnership sets us up for a new world order. People treat it like some random phrase, but, like a politician saying something dramatic, but a new world order isn't new. It's not a shock value headline. It's been a consistent theme coming out of the World Economic Forum for years now. And they've been telling, you the same thing over and over again. We need to rebuild. We need to, coordinate. We need interoperability. And we need a more efficient global system. And let me translate that into plain English for you guys so you guys can really understand this. You can't run a new global era on old rails. You can't build a modern city with horse trails. You can't run a digital economy on a settlement system that still operates like it's 1973. So when people hear this term, New World Order, they imagine war, chaos, a dramatic switch. But the real New World Order isn't tanks, it's infrastructure, it's plumbing, it's the pipes behind the walls. And when they replace the pipes, the entire building changes. Here's a story, back in the early days of the internet, most people didn't believe it would matter. They thought it was a nice, like little nerd toy, a niche, a weird hobby, something for universities. And then one day, without fireworks, without a big announcement, it became the foundation for everything. Everything is on these phones, shopping, banking, media, work, wars, politics, culture, everything. And the people who got rich weren't the ones who bought, internet stocks after everyone understood it. It was the ones who understood the infrastructure phase when it didn't look, super exciting yet. Now watch closely. This is exactly where XRP is at, because XRP isn't trying to become a meme coin. It's not trying to be a casino chip. XRP is positioned like something else, like the early internet, not the websites, not the ads, not the social networks, the protocols, the pipes, the structure instead. So, what you need to really understand here is, XRP isn't the story. XRP is what happens when the story becomes real. You want the keyword interoperability. This is where most people lose the plot. They think money is digital because they see numbers in a banking app, but that's not digital money. That's a digital receipt right there. The real system behind the scenes, it's still fragmented, still stitched together, still using patchwork, and the world is realizing it's a problem, because globalization didn't stop. It actually accelerated. And now everything needs to talk to everything: countries, banks, payment apps, tokenized assets, CBDCs, stablecoins, trade fi rails, crypto rails. So what do they need? They need a universal connector, a bridge, a transition layer like the Rosetta Stone for value. And once you have it, boom, the entire world becomes connected in a way that changes absolutely everything. So that's why you keep hearing the same exact phrase over and over again. These systems, if implemented properly, will result in a new world, because they simply will. And here's where XRP comes into the picture, not as a theory, not as a dream, but as a piece of the machine. Now, listen, guys, I need you to understand this. This isn't about influencers. This isn't about, Twitter hype. This isn't about who has the loudest community. This is about the architects, the builders, the people who design systems that governments and banks actually use. And when you start seeing certain names appear over and over again in the same circles, that's when the alarm bells should go off for you guys. Let's talk about, someone named Michael Richards, IBM, years of architecture work, premium mobile money systems. This is not a guy building a meme token. This is a guy building plumbing. And then there's, Constain Perpec, excessive Remine, Swift architect right there, decades into the system. People don't realize what Swift represents. Swift is like the nervous system of global banking communication, like not the money itself, not the liquidity, but the actual messaging right there, the coordination layer. And if you were to try to modernize, global payments, what would you want, or who would you want? The people who built the old world so they can architect the new one. They need to have the knowledge of the old to come in with the new. So you have, Modoc's, ecosystem, you have the Interledger Foundation, the Interledger Protocol, ILP, and Chris Larson, one of the co-founders of Ripple, he even said it himself. He said, having the combination of ILP with XRP, that's the kind of killer formula. I want you to actually sit with that. ILP is about interoperability. XRP XRP is about liquidity and settlement utility. Together, you pair those two together, ooh, it's like building a highway system and then pairing it with jet fuel. That's not hype. That is real structure right there, real world utility. Now, let me hit you with an analogy. The Cambrian explosion, one of the biggest leaps in life on Earth. Before it, life existed, but it was slow, limited. After it, suddenly, diversity exploded. New species, new forms, new ecosystems. Why? Because conditions changed. The environment became favorable for massive expansion. Now, apply that into the financial world. If the world gets interoperability layers, if the pipeline becomes modern, if settlement becomes instant, if liquidity becomes seamless, you don't just get faster payments, you get an explosion of new business models right there. You get new marketplaces, new financial products, new tokenized everything. And this is the part, most people miss out on here. They miss the real plot. They think crypto is just a revolution. No, no, no. Interable value transfers is the revolution. Crypto is just one chapter, and XRP itself is positioned like a tool inside that revolution. That's why they keep building quietly, because you can't, implement a system like this unless society and regulation are aligned. And that line alone tells you everything you need to know. They're not guessing, they're not gambling, they're coordinating. Now, let's talk about the weirdest thing in, modern financial history. The DTCC said something that should have like shocked the entire market. They basically admitted this is one of the first times retail led and institutions follows. Like you think back to history, you look at the stock market, you look at any other market, you see institutions are always first and then retail comes in after. But this time with crypto, retail was first before the institutions. So that's why it's just so interesting for crypto. Institutions lead. Retail usually arrives late. Retail gets the leftovers, but this time a portion of retail got early exposure to digital assets, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and yes, XRP. And in cycles, like those early holders became really wealthy. And guys, think like what happens next? Institutions they're not going to ignore it forever. They study it, they map it, they plan, they build around it. But the public, they see only price action. They assume nothing's happening. I mean, like, look at BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. Years ago, he used to say that he was against Bitcoin, called Bitcoin a scam. And now the biggest institution in the world has Bitcoin ETFs. They're acquiring Bitcoin for their clients. So like, that's how every major institution, or major transition works with these institutions. Like the public sees fireworks, the insiders see blueprints. Let me be very clear here with you guys. People ask, why is it taking so long? Because you don't upgrade the global financial system like you update an iPhone. You're not installing a new app. You're rebuilding pipes. It's in a building. While people are still using bathrooms, you mess up, so society breaks. So the process looks like this, like regulations, pilots, frameworks, compliance, interoperability, institutional readiness, then mass rollout. And by the time the rollout happens, what do you guys think happens, guys? The wealth transfer is already in motion because the first money isn't chasing. The first money is really just positioning. And when you finally see it on the chart, you're not early. You're just reacting. That's why this quiet phase matters the most, because it's the accumulation phase of the system. Now, here's the part that makes people uncomfortable, but we have to say it. We can't just deny it right there. The push for digital identity, digital infrastructure, mobile devices, standards, inclusion. People hear financial inclusion and think it's charity, but inclusion is also a network effect. If everyone is connected, then everything can be routed. And when you look at the people involved, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gets mentioned. It's been mentioned in the past. Architects, standards, mobile payment standards, like Miller Able, principal program manager, wireless device standards, NFC, payment architecture. Let's connect just everything together, put it all together, all in one big financial system, not in a flashy way, but in a technical way, because once the standard exists, the system scales. That's how the internet did it. Standards first, explosion second. This is why it feels like a movie, because you have the same blueprint repeating. Build the standard, build the connector, build the rails, then watch the world change. Now, we're at the moment that matters, the switch, the moment where the plumbing is finished, the approvals are stacked, the corridors are ready, and liquidity starts moving, like it's supposed to. And what happens? All the dominoes fall into place. They fall fast because now it's not one bank, it's not one country, it's one connection that leads another connection, to another connection, to another connection, and then suddenly it's everywhere.